Thank you for joining today's webinar, the 2020 Immigration and Border Challenges. My name is Sarah Larson. I'm the Marketing Manager here at Invest Buffalo Niagara, the Buffalo Niagara region's economic development organization, and the host of this and past webinars on topics worth diving into in economic development. My goal is to identify the experts our audience is in need of hearing from. And with 90+ attendees on this webinar today, we're assured that this is a hot topic. And so today, joining me are 4 presenters. First, from our NBN offices is Vice President of Business Development, Kim Grant. Kim has a strong background in business development, particularly in advanced manufacturing and the medical device and biotechnology industries. She has a strength in cultivating partnerships with the academic space while attracting companies to the region by identifying funding sources. 2 of our guest presenters today are Elizabeth Claren and Eileen Martin, both immigration lawyers with Lippes Mathias, one of many partners we often work with here at Invest Buffalo Niagara when a company is interested in expanding to the region. Elizabeth has 17 years of experience in immigration. She represents clients from around the globe across virtually every industry. Eileen has 25 years of experience in immigration law, assisting clients from around the world. And also a Canadian guest presenter today with us is Betsy Kane. She's one of the founding partners of the Capel Kane Immigration Lawyers. She has 25 years of experience in Canadian corporate immigration law. Kim, Elizabeth, Eileen, and Betsy will share with you today some of the challenges being faced with our current border restrictions. They will help you understand them, how they affect or do not affect your ability to do business across the border, and how businesses are continuing to successfully plan their expansion to the U.S. despite these challenges. Okay, so before our presenters begin, I'd like to do one more thing. I'd like to get started and get to know our large audience today with a poll question. I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll for you. And so our poll question today is, do you have a Canadian business? And if so, are you also established on the U.S. side as well? So this will help our presenters today understand the audience that they're speaking to. And we can say the largest of our audience does have a Canadian business and is also established on the U.S. side. And then it's kind of split almost. We have a variety of those who are just interested in this border challenge that we've been facing currently, and others that are considering an expansion to the U.S. Either in more recent 6 to 12 months or maybe longer. So pretty interesting there. And so now, without further ado, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Kim Grant to get us started.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, Eileen, Elizabeth, and Betsy, our presenters today. We're really looking forward to your comments. Just a little bit about Invest Buffalo Niagara and the region that we're talking about. For years when I started in my career, we talked about the Golden Horseshoe. And the Golden Horseshoe, the area from Toronto all the way over to Rochester, representing, almost 8 million people, is rich in technology, university expertise, manufacturing, but we have such close proximity to our countries. And so especially with the pandemic, we are talking to a lot of companies that, as a result of this situation, are looking to nearshore or onshore going forward and be closer to their customers. So I just wanted to give you an idea with this map of the scope in which companies are coming to us. The other thing that we're noticing as a trend from the pandemic is people are looking to the Buffalo Niagara region to get out of urban settings. Now that working from home is becoming more and more acceptable, they're looking to leave those urban hubs and be in a more cost-effective region where they have more of a work-life balance. So you're going to see some of these themes and some of the companies that we're addressing. That was the impetus for a lot of them looking at our region to expand and grow. So why would a company want to expand in the US? There is a real brand around the USA label. Definitely the cost of doing business on this side of the border is significantly less, some of it because of taxation and some of it because of the labor costs. As we've learned during the pandemic, there are delays that can occur in supply chain. I'd like to say that Invest Buffalo Niagara is helping us get back to business. We definitely want to help address this because this situation caught a lot of us off guard, and we want to make sure that we're setting people up for success in the future if other incidents occur. And so that onshoring and nearshoring, and not relying so heavily on Asia and China, I think that this is a trend that we're going to continue to see. And also by coming from Canada to the US, it allows a company to expand in the safest way possible. So anything that happens on this side of the border isn't going to incur any legal challenges that happen on the Canadian side and vice versa. So having that separation provides some really mitigating any risk of things happening as growth and innovation happens on both sides. They can share resources, but have that separation that provides stability and infrastructure going forward. So why Buffalo Niagara? You are within 8 hours of 39% of the US population. Our proximity to the Southern Ontario border is absolutely second to none. And people are recognizing that. And so it's a twofer. It's a BOGO. It's buy one, get one. You get access to two countries and the proximity just can't be beat. It's affordable. When this pandemic started, I was talking to colleagues in New York City who were living in their 600 square foot apartment. And for the same cost that they were paying for that, people here are living in a 3-bedroom center entrance colonial and having a little bit of elbow room from their children and their spouses and their partners. So I can't say enough about the effective costs of living in this region. Low cost hydropower, we're finding more and more that is a competitive edge for us. When I talk to my colleagues and my friends in other parts of the country, that's a huge part of their ability to be profitable and looking for ways to economize. If you think of the old three-legged stool, cost, quality, and service, pick two, you don't get all three. Well, that is an absolute factor in coming to do business in the Buffalo Niagara region. And we have a strong manufacturing base. The fact that our history lies with the automobile dealerships, 3M, Saint-Gobain, Bethlehem Steel, all of those, that intellect and all of that expertise is embedded in our region and in our talent. And our community colleges and universities are working very diligently to increase the number of CNC operators and people that will meet the need of the retiring workforce in that manufacturing base. And specific to New York State, our corporate income tax for manufacturing is zero. And so in a time when taxes are somewhat elevated and probably will go up as a result of the pandemic, I think it's important to note that it's very cost effective, specific for manufacturing in New York State. So please note that over the last 20 years, Invest Buffalo Niagara has attracted over 116 international businesses to build and expand in the US, and they planted their seed, their foothold in Buffalo. 100 of those 116 came from Canada. It has been beneficial for them. It's been beneficial for our region. Proximity, ease of doing business over the border, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. It's just been a win-win all the way around. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Eileen and hear from the experts.
Thank you, Kim. It is so nice to be with all of you addressing old and new friends this afternoon. I'm going to initiate our conversation about immigration-related issues with the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. What a great time to pass such a historic piece of legislation and treaty during a pandemic. What does it mean for immigration? Well, as far as the immigration categories for the United States, for Canada, and for Mexico, they've remained largely unchanged. So it's more or less business as usual at the border for purposes of filing applications under the professional classification, under intercompany transfer classification, and the treaty investors and treaty traders, which for U.S. purposes get filed with the U.S. consulate. Business visitors under NAFTA continue to be admitted at the ports of entry as well under the USMCA, similar to the way they were under NAFTA. Under the professional classifications, the categories have remained unchanged. There has been some clarification. For instance, the new treaty specifically indicates that actuaries do fall under the classification of mathematician, and plant pathologist falls under the classification of biologist. Other than that, we're working with the same classifications that we always did. From the U.S. perspective, as far as applying for status at the U.S. border or through U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, things have not changed in terms of our ability to continue to do that, or for the beneficiaries to do that themselves. When one applies at the border, they actually, in the last couple of weeks, have been asked to remain in their vehicle, as opposed to going into the immigration office, waiting in the waiting area, and having the assessment occur at the kiosk desks. So that has been a little bit of a recent development. With U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, petitions get sent off by mail to a service center, and a decision is rendered on them. As far as why we would apply through one versus the other, having been an immigration officer myself, I believe it is easier to say no to a stack of papers than it is to an individual. So, and many of my clients anyway present very well. So I like to send them to a port of entry where they can speak to their experience, speak to the business that they're coming in to work for, and their role in that business. I think sometimes it becomes a bit more difficult to capture that on paper. And as a result, I think that the individuals at the ports of entry, the Customs and Border Protection officers, often do a more thorough job than Citizenship and Immigration Services when we mail off a petition. So my general preference, although there are times for strategy reasons I might do things differently, generally I prefer port of entry applications. I will say though that the Buffalo Niagara region is and has been a great region for implementation of NAFTA, and I have full belief that it will continue to do so for the USMCA. Talking about entering the US during the pandemic, I would like to introduce my partner, Elizabeth Claren.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, we've had a steady stream of presidential proclamations that are deeply impacting people around the world who are trying to come to the US now during this COVID-19 pandemic. The good news for probably a lot of people on this call who are Canadians is that a lot of these don't apply to Canadians or wouldn't impact Canadians because Canadians in most instances, with a few exceptions, are visa exempt. So we talk, you hear all the time colloquially about visas. I need a TN visa, I need an L1 visa. As a Canadian, you're actually not getting a visa. You're not going to the US consulate or embassy in Canada and getting a piece of paper in your passport in most instances that then permits you to be admitted to the US. huge perk for Canadians. So there's some confusion around that visa issue, and a lot of the way that these presidential proclamations are worded, they tend to really address visas and visa-related entries. Let's talk about how they're impacting non-immigrants. Like I said, there's a couple exceptions in Canada, which we'll talk about, but in most instances, you guys aren't getting a visa, so it's not impacting you. However, it could impact Canadians that are outside Canada at the moment, and it's certainly impacting people around the world who are in other countries. A number of presidential proclamations have addressed entries by anyone who has recently been in or in a number of different countries, including China, Iran, all the Schengen area countries in Europe, the UK, the Republic of Ireland, and Brazil. And that list is probably going to continue to shift as the COVID-19 numbers shift. So, the presidential proclamations barring entry for anyone who's been in those countries in the 14-day period prior to their attempted entry to the US really is based on COVID-19 numbers. The bad news is once you get on that list, so far we haven't seen anyone removed from that list. So he has added countries via presidential proclamation. However, the president hasn't removed any countries from that list. So we're keeping a close eye on that. There are some national interest exceptions for certain travelers from the Schengen area, the UK and Ireland. They really are very interested in making sure, the US government's interested in making sure that business travelers, investors, academics, treaty traders, certain other people as well, including athletes and staff members of major athletic teams, those types of things, that all of those individuals who the US feels their work is in the national interest, that they are able to come in. So that's a recent thing, actually. We had that just last week. The government updated that certain business travelers, investors, treaty traders, academics, students may qualify for national interest exceptions from those presidential proclamations. So they're trying to open it up in certain ways, which is great. But again, for most Canadians, this isn't going to impact you directly. It might impact you for family members, friends, coworkers that are in other countries. Immigrant side, Canadians are unfortunately being impacted by, there's a presidential proclamation that basically says we're not going to issue green cards to anyone from outside the US through the end of 2020, because they want to make sure that Americans are, America first, and they want to make sure Americans are able to get jobs, and it's really driven by that. From outside the US, there's a process to get a green card through the consulates and embassies across Canada. That's called immigrant visa processing, and unfortunately they have suspended those services through the end of the year. Does that mean Canadians can't get green cards this year? Not necessarily. If you're already in the US or you're applying from within the US for a green card, there's a separate process called adjustment of status. People who are in the US, for instance, in a NAFTA-based, free trade-based status category, can quite easily still apply for green cards from within the US. The suspension of those green card services through the end of the year, there's some notable exceptions though for those who want to apply for green cards, or unfortunately were in the queue for green cards when this whole COVID-19 pandemic hit in March. I had one guy who literally his green card interview at the consulate in Montreal was 2 days away, and he got blocked out of his interview and has not been rescheduled yet. And it's very frustrating for people in that situation, particularly because we're not exactly sure when they're going to resume those services. They could resume them anytime. We have some information that the Department of State did announce they're reopening consulates and embassies worldwide on a phased approach starting July 15th, but they didn't give any schedule of who's opening when or what services they're going to resume. In some instances, they're saying they're going to resume limited services. So the exceptions to that blanket immigrant visa suspension of services include immediate relatives of US citizens, for instance, spouses. That's a big concern for a lot of people. A lot of Canadians, they marry Americans and they want to come down to the US, and so technically they should be eligible to continue the green card process even throughout 2020. minor children are included in that as well. EB5 investors, healthcare professionals. There's a number of different categories of individuals who should still be in that queue for green cards. In some instances at the moment, that's still limited by Department of State, suspension of services in general and limited staffing at the consulates and embassies throughout Canada. That should be resuming. We've got our fingers crossed for any time now. So with that, I'm going to pass on to Eileen again to talk about some other areas that Canadians might be impacted by these Department of State closure of U.S. diplomatic posts and embassies across Canada and worldwide.
In March, like so many other things, the U.S. embassies and consulates stopped doing interviews. As Beth mentioned, that doesn't affect a whole lot of Canadians because most Canadians are visa exempt when they come to the U.S. The one notable exception on the non-immigrant visa side is for e-visa applicants. E-visas are the E1 treaty traders and E2 treaty investors or their employees. It's become a very popular type of visa for individuals to obtain in order that they can work in the United States. They're a 5-year visa, and we have found the consulate to be quite facilitative over the last several years. Unfortunately, when there is no interview opportunity available, the visas cannot be issued. So we've had we had clients who have filed right before the pandemic hit, and certainly during the course of the pandemic, but we have not had anybody who has been able to be interviewed. We have some interviews scheduled at the end of August. However, those same individuals also scheduled in April and also scheduled in July. So we don't know if their late August interviews are going to be honored or not. We're hopeful, but not necessarily confident because they have been repeatedly put off. So certainly the e-visa application process has been affected, both for individuals who are getting new visas and for those who may be renewing their visas. Beth mentioned the exemptions in terms of being able to get visas, and these specifically relate to those who are assisting the U.S. for national security, defense, assisting the U.S. in making a financial comeback from the coronavirus, and athletes and dependents. However, we are seeing resistance from the consulates and embassies to dealing with these exemptions and actually issuing visas. Almost without exception, we are seeing that the consulates and embassies are not issuing visas, even where somebody may meet the exemption requirements. When will normal services be available? Beth is absolutely correct that we don't know. We know that the rollout has begun in a couple of locations in Europe. We are waiting eagerly to see, and something that I always hate to tell people, but it is by checking the websites that we will be able to maintain an idea of what's going on and monitor that over time. The impact clearly is that everything is delayed. At this point, we have several months worth of interviews that have not occurred. We have ongoing applications and petitions being filed. We have a backlog based on the presidential proclamations. So I think that we are going to be seeing a significant backlog. In terms of emergency services, what qualifies? And that is really, once again, on a consulate by consulate or embassy office basis. They will put some information onto their websites about funerals or medical. It appears that they are not very eager to consider any kind of business travel to be emergent. So that certainly makes life very difficult for a lot of individuals. But frankly, there probably isn't much about this pandemic that's been easy, not in the immigration world anyway.
So the US, Canada, and Mexico have mutually determined that non-essential travel between the countries is an additional risk, in the COVID-19 environment, as I think everybody on this call is aware. So what happened on the US side is Customs and Border Protection issued 2 identical orders back in March. They both temporarily restricted non-essential travel at land ports of entry from Canada and Mexico into the US. So basically what these did is they suspended normal operations and processes at the land ports of entry, except for essential travel. And there's a number of different things that are listed as essential travel, most notably, affecting most Canadians might be, travel for medical purposes to the US. I've seen that certainly from some of our clients, travel to attend educational institutions, things that are in the furtherance of lawful cross-border trade. And most importantly to most people on this call, probably travel to work. So that's really fantastic and something that a lot of people don't realize. It's rather broad language. It says travel to work is permitted. So that means if you have a status, a work authorized status that allows you to come across the border into the US to for instance, come across to build your business, to establish your business, or if you want to apply for status to come in and do that, that is very much still available to you. And again, shout out to the Buffalo Niagara region here. It's great for facilitating these kinds of entries for Canadians. They really have been very facilitative, particularly at the Peace Bridge port of entry. We find they really understand the law. They really try very, very quickly to upscale when new policies are published and to determine correct implementation of policies, which are not always very specific. Sometimes we do have to wait for internal guidance to be issued that clarifies things for them. So who can't come in though? Who can't come in are people who are coming in for tourism or recreation, sightseeing, gambling, attending cultural events, anything along those lines. You definitely cannot come across a land port of entry. If you're coming in as a business visitor, though, you technically should still be permitted to come in. We've seen a mixed bag on this one. We had one woman who was coming in to actually go do some consulting with the Pentagon, which you would think would be a super easy entry. And she requested admission as a business visitor and was told, well, where's your letter? Where's your evidence? We need to see more. We're not sure. And despite her best efforts, she couldn't convince them that she was going to consult with the Pentagon. So what we are saying is if you're entering as a business visitor, or if you want to enter as a business visitor, just be prepared. It is more difficult than it was prior to all this craziness starting in March. Bring some paperwork, bring an invitation letter perhaps from the client or the company that you're going to visit, going to interview with, going to negotiate a contract with. Make sure that it's very clear that you have legitimate business purposes for entering the US. And certainly I would say have a name and number ready of someone in the US who can verify what you're asserting at the port of entry. What will happen if you attempt entry and you are not permitted? You'll just be turned back. You will have to probably disclose if you do any future status applications or visa applications that you have been denied entry at some point. But certainly you're better off being honest always than trying to sort of sneak across and sort of misrepresent your purpose of entry. If you're coming over for tourism or you're coming over for recreation or to visit family or something that's not a business entry or a work-related entry, this is not the time to be saying, oh, I'm going to visit this company, or I'm going to do this interview, when it doesn't really exist, or when you really just want to go visit, your great-grandmother in Arkansas. So be very honest. Obviously fraud, misrepresentation are no less of a problem for you at the border than they ever were. And that can get you barred from entering, for future entries for an indeterminate amount of time. So always be honest. If you're traveling with someone who is permitted to enter, but you're just sort of accompanying someone, you want to be careful about doing that, because you could end up with both of you getting turned away. I had one fellow who was coming down from Canada for a work-related surgery in the US. And he wanted to travel with his mom, obviously. He needed someone along to help him post-surgery and to drive him back to Canada. And you know, the initial response when we checked with the Peace Bridge was, nope, she can't come in. He can come in, but she can't come in. And so we were able to get around that by, you know, getting a doctor's letter that confirmed that he needed to have someone along. We cleared it with the port of entry through a supervisor beforehand. They were ready for them to come. We told them when they were coming. So there's ways to do it. They're probably much more familiar with that scenario at this point than they were at the time in the scenario I was just talking about when it had just sort of happened. But I wouldn't take anything for granted. Certainly, you might want to just alert the port ahead of time that, you know, if you do have an entry where you're going to be coming in with someone for a purpose that's not one of those essential travel categories that you're permitted to enter on. Applying for work authorization at a U.S. land port, as Eileen has mentioned, you can still do that. You can apply for TN status. You can apply for your intercompany transferee status at the border. Really, that hasn't changed at all. And we get so many questions from people asking about that. And is it harder? Is it, you know, the procedures might have changed a little, as Eileen said, but, you know, people are still getting that all the time. And in fact, you know, we've shifted some immigration strategies so that we're doing more L's at this point than, you know, perhaps we were doing e-visas, which Eileen just talked about through the consulate there in Toronto. Well, that's backlogged now, and that's, you know, not as smooth and quick a process, but people still need to come and want to come for work purposes. And so they can definitely apply for those intercompany transferees where you qualify status at the border. Entering by air is definitely still possible for any type of entry, including for recreation and tourism. Now, this confuses so many people. It makes no real sense, but the Department of Homeland Security order says land ports of entry, and therefore air is the exception. And we do have people coming in all the time through airports for all different types of purposes. We do, as always, since we have you on the call, we're going to caution you about applying for TN or L1 status for work authorized categories through the airports. Typically, we find, particularly in the Niagara region, Buffalo Niagara region, the land ports of entry, really the customs officers there have a very strong grasp of the law and of how to interpret things correctly. So you're kind of always better off, almost always better off going to a land port of entry. They are also much more willing to engage if someone is missing a piece of information that they want to see. More often than not, we have, you know, we'll get someone, for instance, who's a newer CBP officer, and they won't really understand what's required for an L1, and they'll, you know, mistakenly ask for something that's not required. It's very easy to go back to them and say, no, actually that's not required, you know, and, you know, or here's the piece of information that you asked for that they didn't have, and then they'll just approve that same day still. So, you know, if you can afford the time, then doing that at the land port of entry is sort of always our go-to recommendation. Will this be changing? It could. I mean, if an order or a policy is issued that says, you know, yeah, now the air travel is also restricted, you know, so that we don't transmit or spread COVID-19, absolutely that could happen. Things are changing so fast at the border all the time. It's great to check in and find out if you have any question, particularly if you have significant plans to expand your business into the US or to continue to do business in the US if you're already here. It's great to keep an eye on these things. We do at Lippes Mathias, we do have an immigration blog. We post there very, very regularly with any updates related to immigration. So as those things are happening, you can just Google Lippes immigration blog and it'll pull up right at the top.
So it's important to know that the US federal government has no quarantine rules at this point in time, meaning that any quarantines that do exist in the context of either state or regional or local governments. I can tell you I'm very familiar with New York's quarantine rules right now because I had 2 trips planned in the month of August, one of which I will not be taking unless the state to which I was planning to go comes off the quarantine list. The other I can go to because I'll be in no state that is on the list for more than 24 hours. Every state has different rules about its quarantine. It has different different mandates for who is going to impose that, whether it's health officials, whether it's peace officers, and how they're going to go about doing that, whether they're going to be imposing rules at the time that somebody lands in the state. There are also alternatives to quarantine in some places, not all, but in some places, that if you can show a negative COVID test within 72 hours, either before or after, then you may be able to avoid the quarantine. Once again, I hate to do this, but websites are the best way to keep up to date. While we've been on this webinar, I have no idea what states have changed their quarantine rules. And it's really best, if you want to stay up to date, to check the state that you're going to. The penalties typically are fines or misdemeanors, not terribly significant, but at the same time, they do have some teeth to them. Can I enter the United States using Nexus? Yes, you can. That's kind of an add-in. It doesn't really relate to quarantine, but we've been getting the question a lot. And yes, Nexus is still a valid document for entry to the United States. And during the hours that the Nexus kiosks or lanes are open, Nexus can still be used. I think you're going to hear something a little bit different from Betsy on how the quarantine rules are different in Canada.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank Lippes Mathias and Invest Buffalo Niagara for inviting me to this webinar. I'm going to talk very generally at a high level, and I'm going to take my position with regard to basically cross-land border entry into Canada. And if anyone has questions about flying or so forth, or any detailed questions, they can ask me at the end. So I want to start off by saying that Canada has federal travel restrictions, and the only test for American citizens coming into Canada is whether their purpose of entry is optional and discretionary. And how that is interpreted is impacted by the facts and the circumstances. So all you have to prove is that your entry to Canada is non-optional and non-discretionary. And thus far, the hard rules or the hard interpretations are that if you need to work in Canada as a business visitor or a temporary foreign worker or intercompany cross-border work, your work in Canada is deemed to be non-optional and non-discretionary. So you are allowed to come into Canada for work purposes, including your traditional business visitor. The other hard non-optional, non-discretionary purpose of entry right now, it just changed on June 8th, is for immediate family members, which includes a spouse, children, and certain other immediate family members of permanent residents and Canadian citizens. And this is where we have seen a lot of tension across the Canada-US border is with regard to family members. And there have been interpretive guides to help people come through the border. Now, when I say the only test is optional, is not being for optional and discretionary purposes, what I want to say to you today is that there are various interpretations, and at the end of the day, the Canada Border Services Agency has the discretion to approve any type of case where you can prove that you need to come into Canada for those certain reasons. There are many scenarios, and the government has released, or it's been released through litigation, various scenarios that the CBSA will entertain. And over and above those scenarios, if somebody has a compelling need, there's a possibility to present your case, if you will, in advance of attending at the port of entry to see if management of the Canada Border Services Agency at the port that you're planning to attend to would consider it and receive the application in advance by way of paper application. In Canada, we also have provincial travel restrictions, and those are mostly in the Atlantic Canada, where you cannot move between provinces. As well, BC has a requirement to register a quarantine plan on entry. Now, the biggest issue that we are seeing in Canada are the quarantine requirements, because we have mandatory federal quarantine requirements that apply to everybody. And they apply as soon as you enter Canada. and they are 14 days mandatory quarantine on entry, where you must attend to your destination without stopping for gas or anything. And there are very few exceptions as to who can be exempted from the mandatory quarantine process. In order to prove that you are going to adhere to the quarantine requirement, you must have a quarantine plan, which sets out where you're going, how you will get food and medicine, and what you will be doing to monitor your symptoms over that 14-day period. With regard to seeking an exemption, there are some generous provisions that allow for Americans or people applying at the port of entry to seek an exemption. There are two ways to seek an exemption. One, you can fly in advance by email to the Public Health Agency of Canada, but those applications are taking up to 30 days, if not longer, so that is not necessarily the most expeditious and business-friendly manner in which to do it. And even if you get an advanced opinion that you are exempt from the quarantine requirements, the ultimate decision is made at the port of entry by the Canada Border Services Agency. So at the end of the day, you're probably best advised to make your application directly at the border, because the Canada Border Services Agency's officers are also deemed quarantine officers. So it's easier, faster, and basically most expeditious to do it at the port of entry. Now, there are certain people or certain business persons who are able and are already exempt or deemed exempt from the quarantine requirements. And these are people who are moving goods and people across the borders, like such as truck drivers, and people who are basically going to work in a cross-border community. So if you are living in Toronto but work in Buffalo or vice versa, people who will go to their normal place of employment in a cross-border community and are working in essential services such as critical infrastructure in the energy and utility sector, information technology sector, health, food, water, finance sector, transportation, safety, government, or manufacturing, you are entitled to an exemption, but you must assert that request at the port of entry by explaining how your particular circumstances fall within the noted exemptions that have been provided by government. It's called Order in Council. As well, technicians and certain specialists can come into Canada in an after-sales service type capacity. So if you're coming to repair machinery or installing machinery or inspecting machinery that is important for critical infrastructure. So if you're coming to install, inspect, or repair machinery that is required to process visas, passports, currency, for example, you will be able to come in, providing you can demonstrate you're a technician or specialist coming into one of these essential service sectors, so with a contract and so forth, and that you have to prove as well that the work is required immediately on entering. The Chief Public Health Officer has determined that certain persons, any person coming into Canada to perform essential services, and the list is several pages long, and so a lot of people can fit within the essential services, can request an exemption from the quarantine requirement. In that case, you really have to put together a strong package and materials to prove that your essentiality and the fact that you're coming in and the work that you need to do must be done within the 14 days following your entry. As well, the Ministers of Foreign Affairs, Citizenship and Immigration, and Public Safety can determine that you're coming in the national interest and exempt you from the quarantine requirements. We're seeing that, as you can see, in the sports field in Canada. If you're coming to provide emergency services, also people crossing the border to receive essential medical treatments and services are exempt from the quarantine requirement. Certain medical personnel, other individuals who can come into Canada as if they live in a integrated trans-border community, such as Southern Ontario in the Buffalo Niagara region or the Windsor Detroit region. And if you can prove that your habitual place of residence is in the region. So if you're coming and you live and you have you need to come in and you live and work in this area, there's an exemption from the quarantine, provided you're not interacting or having contact with vulnerable people or people over 65. So basically, there's a lot of movement to get the exemption. You make the application with detailed submissions at the border. As you'll see in my panel, in my slides, detailed submissions include referencing the law, the policy, the internal policies that have been published by CDSA and the Government of Canada, IRCC. You need to have a quarantine plan in place, where you're going to be, how you're going to get your food, what delivery services you're going to use. And we've been quite good in developing a regional quarantine plan with getting the various food delivery and medication delivery services in place. You don't think in terms of that depth, but you do. If for whatever reason, if you're planning to make an exemption request and you think you fall within one of the exemption categories, it's always good to have your quarantine plan prepared in the event that the officer declines it. And the other thing you need to be mindful of at the border is that it's possible that the officer that you're dealing with chooses to direct you back and issues you a document that says you've been directed back. In that circumstances, it is highly recommended that you retain and get legal counsel, because what can happen is that the officers can find you inadmissible to Canada if you return to the border contrary to the terms that you've been asked to go back. So there are ways to represent yourself further following a direct back, but it's advised to have counsel approach the border, the superintendent at the port of entry, and present your case on paper and tee up your return to the border, so that it's not a surprise and that you have basically an understanding that in representing yourself that you would be admitted, or they were prepared to entertain your request, perhaps with more documentation and more evidence that was not available at first instance. So what I want to say is Canada is open for business. We have a lot of exemptions, both for the entry requirements and the quarantine requirements. And this includes business visitors. We must prove that the place which the destination of entry is operating, and I'd be prepared to entertain more questions at the Q&A.
Thank you, Betsy.
You're welcome.
So I want to leave time for those questions. So I'll speak very briefly about how Invest Buffalo Niagara can help facilitate coming to the US, going back to Canada, making sure that we are back to business. I can cite examples where we're doing cross-border due diligence meetings. Thank gosh for technology and Zoom and webinars. We have site search assistance, and all of this is free of charge. You contact Invest Buffalo Niagara. We have a network of 352 brokers and realtors we work with, and they provide us with links and sites, and we can go there and do FaceTime and web chat and take video of the sites. If you can't be here in person, we've started incentives for tax abatement and grants that are put in place to attract businesses to grow and create new opportunities in the region. And one of the most important things that we're doing is the human resource piece. We have a huge campaign called Be in Buffalo, where we're bringing back some of that talent to the Buffalo Niagara region and repatriating some of that expertise. I'm going to turn it back over to Sarah, who's going to talk about some of the other materials on our website and newsletters to keep you informed and to continue the conversation.
Thanks, Kim. Kim mentioned, that there's over 100 companies that we've brought to the Buffalo Niagara region from Canada. Many of them are already doing business in the US and decided it was time to establish here. We help them do so, and Kim and our partners can help you do that. And in the meantime, to get more information, you can go to our website. You can download toolkits, these guides, full of information on legal information, accounting information, HR, and do a little bit of research yourself. You can also download our expansion checklist. It kind of shows you the process that we would go through with you. There's also additional presentations like this one that will be on our website. And if you have any ideas of other topics that are really hot for you that you'd like us to cover in the future, we also would love to hear from you. And you can stay connected to us. You can sign up for our newsletter called Access US. Great e-news updates, educational articles, new things on our website we'll let you know, and events like this, webinars, when we're having those, we'll make sure you're aware of those as well. Our information here is on the website. You're welcome to reach out to any of our presenters today. And we do have some questions that have come in, and I'm going to ask our presenters to stay on for a few more minutes and answer some of these questions. So I think really we did answer this, Betsy. Clarification that you were able to give us is that one of the best non-optional ways of going into the US is for business purposes, and that was one of the questions, is if business visitors are permitted to enter Canada under this travel restriction.
Thank you. They are. In fact, there is a new internal bulletin that was circulated that is saying if the person is coming for business and they're, for example, in an essential service or doing after-sales service or doing something where there's an immediate need, it appears that for land border applications that you can come in as a business visitor. If there is pushback, there is always an option to seek a work permit, which I had just mentioned in my presentation, is deemed a non-optional and non-discretionary. So if there is, for whatever reason, some pushback on the business visitor piece, the applicant could also present a work permit application, even if it's for a short period of time, at which point it's deemed non-optional and non-discretionary. So from what the bulletins we're reading, land border applications are allowed. It's a little trickier if you're coming by air, because the problem by air is that you have to convince a airline personnel that you fall within an exemption, and business visitors on the Government of Canada state are not 100% clearly articulated as people who are exempt from the travel restrictions. So that's the air travel is difficult, but a land border, it is clear cut. So what we would do for people, for example, who are coming from, let's say, California and need to come up to, southern or eastern Ontario, we would be advising them to fly up to Buffalo, for example, and cross overland and make their application overland. So they would potentially avoid having to both convince an airline and the CBSA on landing. So that's a bit of a strategy, but there are tools in our back pocket to help business visitors navigate this if they absolutely need to come to Canada during this time.
Okay, and so that clarifies going from the US to Canada. And I know that Eileen and Elizabeth spoke in the similar nature of coming from Canada to the US for work purposes. And so I think the theme is to be informed and be prepared. I know we have a local manufacturer who's been essential this entire time, and they do have a Canadian employee that they developed a letter for, and the employee has carried that back and forth even through Nexus, and they have been stopped even through Nexus in question, but with that letter they have had no issues going back and forth from Canada to the US and US to Canada for work.
And Sarah, and Beth jumping in here for a second. What Beth was saying also applies to the U.S. that we as well can pivot strategy if those business visitor entries are becoming burdensome. If you're getting hassled too much, or if you're not having success with that, or feeling nervous about it even. We do this all the time. We've been doing this for a while now, prior to COVID-19, where the visitor entries have become more frequent. For instance, we oftentimes will find a category of work authorization to apply for that just makes things much smoother for people. We can do that on the US side too.
Okay, so Elizabeth, I'm going to go to you then. Regarding entering the US during the pandemic, do you see some of those trends continuing over this year, and then, starting to impact Canadians more significantly at some point? And then also, do you think the US presidential election coming up might change things one way or another?
Oh, good question. Yeah. So certainly the land border ports of entry, for instance, the restriction on the recreational entries to the US, that's set to expire technically on August 21st, but I didn't even mention that because it's been extended like 2 or 3 times already. And I anticipate that will probably continue to be extended. And I mean, my best guess is it could go as far as the end of this year, very easily right now. So if you're looking to come in recreationally, again, the strategy is still to go through the airports for the time being. I don't know if that will change. It's been around for a while now that you can come in via air and you can't come in over land for those purposes, and they haven't changed it yet. So if there's a significant spike in Canada, certainly, that could happen, just like we're seeing on the state level here in the US. A lot of states are sort of doing this rolling quarantine where they're changing the states that it matters whether you've traveled from based on spiking numbers. So that could happen. In terms of the presidential election, that's an interesting one because I think, obviously if President Trump gets elected, we're probably going to just continue to see more of the same. He's going to continue to be protectionist of American interests. And, once we see the economy recovering, maybe we'll loosen things up a little, but I can't even say that I could see that happening if he's having a successful run by kind of controlling things. I think he's going to continue to do that. If Biden gets in, there's a lot of speculation based on campaign promises and sort of overarching statements of sort of policy positions. Right now, I think it's important to remember that, in an election year, anything we're hearing about what you believe and not seeing in terms of actual actions like presidential proclamations, it's a lot of campaign promises at this point. So it may significantly change things if Biden or someone else is voted into office in November. I am wary of saying that it would, though, simply because on the statewide level, you see the Democratic Party governors being very constrictionist with their policies and restrictionist in terms of, they're really New York. You're seeing states like New York, which is probably, arguably one of the most Democrat Party based states in the nation. And it's been one of the most restrictive in terms of quarantine and, protecting its people. And I just can't see that playing out differently on a federal level. I can't see the party implementing an entirely different policy on a federal level than they are obviously promoting on a statewide level. So I think we're probably in for restrictions for 2020 at least, very possibly going into 2021. And I'm not convinced that I think a lot of people have a lot of hope that the presidential election will change things significantly, but I think the only thing that's going to change things significantly is a vaccine or some sort of other significant change in numbers on the COVID-19 side of things.
Well, thank you very much for our audience today and to our presenters. Thank you, Kim, Elizabeth, Eileen, and Betsy for presenting. And your emails here are on the screen, as I mentioned. Our audience is welcome to reach out to you with additional questions. And next steps for anyone that is considering expanding to the U.S., go to our website, connect with Kim. She has a Calendly account that you can actually click right on her calendar and schedule a half-hour discussion with her at your convenience, or pick up the phone and give her a ring. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a nice afternoon.